Hello, how are you? Oh, are you? You're welcome. You took abnormal with me, right? Or adult psychopathology? No, okay. Regardless, you've been in so many of my classes, you probably haven't missed that much. Do you want a hard copy of the syllabus? Yeah. There you go. You're welcome. Be right back. I forgot my. Okay. How's everybody doing? It's on. Yeah, that's about how we are for the first full week of classes, right? Okay, like I said, it takes me a while to learn names, so I'm gonna read the attendance probably for this week, and then I'll be able to start checking y'all off as you come in. So bear with me. So Gabrielle and Justin, Haley. Oh, that's right. Haley has a Nora, I saw. Catherine, awesome. Caitlin. Destiny, I think is on Zoom. Yep. Lauren, Yana is on Zoom. Cameron. Whitney is on Zoom. Day. Checking Zoom. I know there's already starting to be stuff going around. One of my students in one of my other classes has the flu already, so. Lovely, good for Frederica School. Avery. Sadie is on Zoom. Allie. Sarah, and the other Sarah is not here, I don't think. Haley, I saw. Trinity. Is she on the Zoom? Oh, she just signed up, thanks. Daryl will often be on the Zoom, so I'll check that later. Jennifer, I saw. Hunter's not here yet. Grayson and Naya. Awesome. All right, so again, thanks for your patience with my brain taking attendance that way. I very much appreciate it. Also learning like what order. There we go. Perfect. All right, so today we're hopefully gonna finish our lecture here on research methods. Sometimes it takes longer than that, and if so, we'll wrap it up before our discussion on Friday. So let me do just a couple quick things. There we go. I learned during the pandemic that I cannot type and click at the same time that I talk. So, all right. So just to give you all a quick reminder of where we were, we had just talked about correlation and like what's a correlation versus not a correlation, that kind of thing. So we're about to dive into the extensions of the correlational method. So it's not just, let's look at two variables with some questionnaires and see what happens. We can expand this and we can get to some other really cool stuff. So you can do epidemiological studies using the correlational method. So you can look at things like the number of people who have a given personality disorder. So the incidence is the number of new cases that emerge during a given time. And the prevalence is the number of total cases during a given time period. So incidence is new cases, prevalence is total cases. The only way I've been able to remember this myself is the N, you can think of like the N in incidence as new cases. Just little mind tricks that might help, might not. And so the graph in the corner actually shows the prevalence of depression among folks in different age groups, broken down by males and females. So you can see, looking at something like this over different cohorts, these I think are broken up, 10-year periods, you can see it skyrockets for women, unfortunately, sort of around y'all's age. But then it also tends to go up for everybody around my age, looking at it, just because work-related stress and things along those lines. You can also do what are called longitudinal studies, and this involves, I think several of you in our little warm-up the other day thought about longitudinal studies. So longitudinal studies involve observing the same participants on many occasions over a long period of time. So essentially you're doing correlations at a bunch of different time periods. So you might have, start following kids at age 5, and then you also look at them at age 7, age 9, age 11, right? Up to maybe age 19. And so not only can you correlate the questionnaires you give people at each time point, but then what you can start to do, which is really cool, is you can say, okay, if they were scoring high on, let me use something from my own subfield, so I'm around saying things right. So let's say they were scoring high on being dissatisfied with their bodies when they were 9, right? We know unfortunately kids as young as 4 have expressed some body dissatisfaction. Then at age 11, are they more likely to start developing disordered eating habits? Right? And does that predict going forward? Longitudinal studies are not done that often. Can anyone guess what? Yeah, they're expensive, really expensive. If you've got to follow these people, you got to track them down. Often you're paying them each time because you want to keep them in there, keep them participating. Some longitudinal studies will even pay for things like transportation to come to the study site, right? All that adds up. Also, it's just hard, right? To be doing something for this long and have to wait. One of my, I have like what I call conference friends, people I only see once a year at a conference, but as soon as we see each other, we're like, hey, how's it going? She just posted on Twitter, yesterday, I think, that she just got some data from a longitudinal study she's been waiting for 3 years, right? Like, and that's little for a longitudinal study. But like waiting for data could be really frustrating and difficult sometimes for academics. So I don't know how much you all know about the academic cycle, but we're hired at the assistant professor level. We are described here as, I think it's contingent faculty or probationary faculty. Sounds like we did something wrong and we just got here, right? And then you go for tenure, which means basically if you get tenure, they can't fire you unless you do something illegal. But in order to get tenure, you need to show a record of not only teaching well, but doing good research and contributing, right? So if you're doing longitudinal studies, that could be a struggle, right? So some people won't even start doing these until after they get tenure, or structure it such that they can use the data from the first time point to publish on, and then go forward from there. All these little idiosyncrasies and political things that you don't think would affect, like research, but they do. And then structural equation modeling is a really cool way of examining variables within a correlational framework. And you can like really say something causes something, but you can kind of find out like the directionality of the relationships a little more clearly. So this is an example from my master's thesis of structural equation modeling. And so what this is essentially a bunch of correlations, but run all at the same time, taking into account the other ones. And so what I was looking at was trying to predict body dissatisfaction. And I was looking at social pressures from like moms, dads, siblings, peers. I was looking at media pressures. Thin ideal internalization is the idea that you look at media images and you're like, oh, I don't look like that. You start judging yourself, things like that. Self-objectification is this idea that you might get so focused on that you start seeing yourself as like a thing rather than a person. And as you can imagine, that's really detrimental psychologically to think of yourself as a thing, right? And so this model ended up predicting body dissatisfaction pretty strongly. The only one that didn't really work was the social pressure one. I used a novel scale for that, so that might be a problem. I will talk later in the semester about how important it is to have scales that work well. The thing I really liked about the program I used to do SEM is a lot of these stats programs, you have to sit and kind of almost like do computer coding to tell it what to do. This program I use, you got to just draw it and it ran it for you, and it was beautiful. So give you an example of, again, asking a really complex question with correlational data. This was, I had people come into the lab and just fill out questionnaires. Now I would have probably done it online, but that wasn't really an option in 2005. And then just analyze their data based on this. Just to show you a little difference of working at a big university versus here. I got 229 people in, I want to say 2 months. Here we're lucky if we get like 50, right? But that's okay for undergrad level research. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of every type of research, because no one type of research is perfect. So the advantages of correlational research are that it's very cost effective. So in the old school days, when we did use paper and pencil questionnaires, it was just the cost of the copies, basically, right? Especially if your participants are college students who get class or extra credit, right? You're not having to pay them to participate. Nowadays, it's the cost of like having access to a Google form, or I pay a small amount every year to get my own SurveyMonkey account, just because I like that interface better. And it, again, pretty low key. They can be a little more expensive. So for example, I've started at this point in my career to look at more specialized populations. So I've done studies on sexual minorities, so folks who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer. And then I've done studies on gender minorities, so folks who are trans, non-binary, things along those lines. And if I tried to get a big sample of from Virginia Wesleyan, you know, at least people who are out and are willing to participate, there's probably 30-ish, right? I got 300 in a day using these great online crowdsourcing websites where you do pay people, and we try to pay like $15 an hour, basically. So you can get grants to do things like that. And that's still more cost effective than paying people to come in and do an experiment where you're also like the overhead for that. They tend to be pretty efficient. As I mentioned, I got 300 people in like a day from a very specific subset of the population, right? I used a new crowdsourcing site called Cloud Research Connect when I did the gender minorities one, and I actually reached out to them before I ran the study, and I was like, do you know anything about your demographics in terms of what your gender identity breakdown is? And they're like, we have no idea. We don't ask them that when they sign up. But the research shows that about 5 to 8% of the population identifies as other than male or female. And so they have 20,000 people in their database. So you take 5 to 8% of that, right? And that was still more than the 300 I needed. So I was like, let's try it. And it worked. And it was really quick. And you can also get large sample sizes pretty quickly because of that. And specifically much more so than like the case studies we talked about on Monday, right? Where you're really doing in-depth things. Some disadvantages, as we mentioned, as we will always talk about, you can't determine causality from a correlational study. Either variable could influence the other. There could be those unknown variables also influencing it. Generalizability can also be an issue, partly because these are so easy to run and we tend to do them with what we call convenient samples, which is just what it sounds like. It's like the people that it's convenient to survey, right? So a lot of times it is undergraduate research pools, which typically consist of undergrad students in intro psych, but sometimes upper level classes as well. What might be different from the general population if we're only using intro level psych students? Like, how might those participants differ than if we could get people of the same age in the general population? Yeah, they're all going to college, right? And what do you need in order to go to college? Money, right? We don't all feel it, right? But we all have privilege just being in this room because we have the ability to be in this room, right? And I know that some of you are like, dude, I'm working 3 jobs and I have loans and I get it, right? But there are people who can't even get to that threshold. I was in your same shoes. I was like an RA and working on campus to try to like cover everything. So I totally get it. In fact, Mott College is now one of the top 3 most expensive colleges in the nation. How exciting. There's people who are like, oh, you're gonna send your daughter there? Like, not unless she gets a full ride, we can't afford it, right? So yeah, that's a big piece of it. What else might be different from the general population if you just look at college students? Something we might not think about here as much because our population actually is pretty diverse at Virginia Wesleyan, but a lot of universities, particularly in Midwestern, Eastern states, are almost all white. So both my undergraduate and my grad school were in Ohio. When I did studies, it would be over 92% of my sample would be white. That doesn't represent, you know, the community as a whole. And so by using these convenience samples, it's like, yeah, this allows us to perpetuate the science, but are we doing so accurately? And so a lot of people are really pushing to find other ways to get to the people that aren't sitting in our interest classes. The other thing we don't get as much of, which you might not think of, is men. Not as many men take psych classes. If you look around our room, we only have 3 men out of 25 students in this room, right? That's pretty typical for psych. I tried to do an in-person study with men when I was on sabbatical a few years ago. I was not teaching. I made myself completely open. I recruited from business classes and rec and leisure classes and math classes, and I got 13 people in a semester. Right? It's hard to recruit men. It can be hard to get gender minorities, right? So we need to make sure we're doing this. Correlational studies are also having people fill out questionnaires, often about things that have happened in the past. And even if it's something like depression questionnaires, typically ask you, in the past 2 weeks, how have you been feeling? Right? Well, that might fluctuate quite a bit, right? You all might have felt, you know, just depending on how you feel about coming back to school, right? You might have felt better or worse before last Wednesday, right? And also, we're not necessarily good at it, right? So if you try to think about, what did I have for lunch last Thursday? I don't remember, right? Like, unless it was something really special, you probably don't remember either. And so people don't necessarily have great memory for these things. They're not always accurate at performing this task. And I've mentioned this previously, we have to worry about how people might want to present themselves, right? They might want to look better than they are. One of the reasons why when I run my studies, especially when I do them in person, I try to have students run it instead of me, is that a lot of my students sign up for the study, right? And I don't want you all to think I'm judging you, right? That shouldn't be part of it, but people might be thinking. Another problem we have, and we'll talk about this with experiments too, is, you know, y'all are very savvy, right? A lot of you have taken psych in high school, right? Been aware of psychological issues for a lot of your lives. And so a lot of folks who participate in psych studies will always be trying to figure out the real reason they're asking questions, right? And because of that, might answer them not purposefully and genuinely, but because they're trying to get at what they think the researcher wants. All right, so now we're going to talk about experiments, the experimental method. And this allows for determination of a causal relationship between 2 variables. So we are moving past the correlation does not equal causation to say, yeah, but if you do a study where you're controlling for as many things as you can control, we are going to be able to talk about causation. So experiments are very carefully run and designed. You have random assignment. So every person who comes in to do your study has an equal likelihood of being put into any of your experimental groups. You have manipulation of an independent variable, often called the IV. And this is what you believe is going to cause the change. And then you measure a dependent variable, or DV, and that's what's assumed to be controlled or influenced by that IV. And sometimes you have multiple levels of your independent variable. Sometimes you have what's called a 2x2, where you may be manipulating it in different ways. And sometimes you're measuring more than one dependent variable. But this is like the heart of what an experiment does. A big thing we want to do when we're doing an experiment is try to eliminate as many confounds, or what are sometimes just called nuisance variables, as we can. So these variables are something other than the IV that can affect your DV. So I'll give you an example. I have a friend who works in cognitive and learning science. They were doing a multi-site study for memory. And they had to throw out an entire semester's worth of data collection at one site because they realized at the end of the semester, the people on site hadn't told them, but there was construction on campus right outside the window. And you've got people trying to do memory stuff that requires attention, right? So it can be something as simple as that. It can be something like, you know, a big event goes on. I have data I presented at a conference that I called an accidental COVID-19 study because I had set up a study to run in spring of 2020 at 3 time points. I didn't think we were going to have a global pandemic, right? I was measuring it for something else, right? But it was certainly affected in really interesting ways. So you have to think about that. So the way that we try to guard against confounds is having things like the control versus experimental group. In the control group, you have people who are not going to be exposed to that independent variable, but they're going to do everything else the same as your people who are going to be exposed to it. And then you compare the outcome of each group, and you can better determine the effects of that IV. The experimental group is the people who do get exposed to the IV. Random assignment, I mentioned in passing already. So everyone in the experiment is as likely to be placed in one group or another. In the past, we did this literally with a coin flip or having people draw a number out of a hat when they came in person. Nowadays, we often use websites like random.org, which has a comprehensive random number generator to place people into groups. And this is to make sure that like all your women don't end up one group and your men are in the other group or something like that. We can also use something called blind design, and we might use this if we're trying a new type of therapy. People tend to think of this in terms of medication, so I'll use that as an example. A blind design is built around placebo therapy, which is the idea that your control group has a imitation that you're substituting, something that looks or tastes like a real medication or a real therapy, but is not. So oftentimes in medical research, this is a sugar pill, right? In therapy, it gets a little trickier, but sometimes this is just you sit down and talk to the person rather than do a specific intervention. And it's designed to get rid of experimenter bias, or what's sometimes called the Rosenthal effect, which is where researchers can unintentionally transmit their expectations to participants. So let's say I come in, I'm conducting the research, and I know this group is getting the placebo, this group is getting the real pill, right? Even if I say the same script and I go, this will really help you, I think take it. To the placebo people, and I go, this is really going to help you, I think take it, right? So to the experimental group, we're already transmitting expectations. So this is where we get into these levels of blind design. So a single blind design would be just the participant doesn't know what they're getting. What I was just describing the necessity for is a double blind design, and that is where the person actually interacting with the participant also doesn't know. Someone behind the scenes knows, right? Because we need to know who had once. But it was really interesting. So I participated in some vaccine research, and I did a flu shot study where they tried an mRNA flu vaccine. I've been getting flu shots since 2020, or sorry, not even 2020, since the year 2000. And I've never had a bad reaction to them. And I was out for 3 days. And I was like, well, next appointment, I was like, well, I'm pretty sure I got the mRNA. And the person who I was interacting with was like, literally, we don't know. They don't tell us, like the computer does it. So double blind design, right? Triple blind comes into play in psychology, where let's say we give example, kids ADHD medication, right? One group gets the ADHD med, one group gets a placebo, and then we have them come in and we're marking things on like a behavioral chart of what they're doing. Triple blind would be that person who's doing the rating is also blind to whether the kids have the placebo or the actual meds. Now, sometimes like me, people are going to be pretty insightful and know right which one they got. One of my grad professors did some studies like this with kids when he was in grad school, where they were actually using the same groups to look at taking your pill versus not. And these kids would come in and be like, it's a placebo day, because they knew, right? They understood the difference in themselves. So sometimes, as much as you try to do this, it's not perfect. Lots of extensions of the experimental method, just like the correlational method. Sometimes you have stuff you can't randomly assign people to. Gender, history of abuse, right? I don't know, whether or not you have a particular personality trait, right? You can't randomly say, I'm going to put you in this group and now you are extroverted, right? It just doesn't work. So then you might do what's called a quasi-experiment, where you use differences that already exist in groups without that random assignment. And then what you do is you match the people who have it with controls of people who are the same age, same social demographic group, etc., who don't have it. Natural experiments occur when nature itself or a larger man-made phenomenon manipulates the independent variable. The example I always use here is 9/11. That was really seminal in my life. I know some of you weren't even alive when that happened, but I was in college at the time. And following September 11th, there was a lot of interest in clinical concerns of like, how can we help the survivors, basically. And so there were studies that examined predictors of developing PTSD, the effectiveness of therapy for those who were influenced by the attacks. And one of my favorite studies was there was even a study looking at the higher incidence of alcoholism among the Red Cross workers who were helping with the recovery. So looking at the helpers. And then what we learned there, they deployed in other man-made and natural disaster sense. So Hurricane Katrina, the nuclear meltdown in Japan. I actually have a friend from grad school who went as part of like a psychological reaction team to work with folks there. And a lot of what they implemented was based on what they learned from September 11th. So you're not trying to like, I think some people see those things like, oh, you're just trying to like make money off a tragedy. I don't know, maybe there are people like that, right? But for psychologists, you're trying to figure out what can we do to help these people in the moment and what can we do to help people in the future. Analog experiments would be using animals in the lab to examine these things. This can be a little harder with personality, although some things we can measure behaviorally in animals. So things like being nurturing, we can study in like male and female rats. And really interesting if they manipulate certain things, like if a male rat is the only rat with a bunch of babies, it starts to act maternal. It doesn't mean to be like programmed, it just does it, right? So some people say this benefits humans and that outweighs any kind of costs. There are people, including our neighbors PETA, who have their office in downtown Norfolk, who would say this is cruel and unusual and not an accurate representation. So a lot of people are kind of surprised when we look at advantages and disadvantages for experiments, because again, these are often considered, this is the gold standard, this is science, this is what you should be doing. But there are advantages and disadvantages to each thing, like I said. So with experiments, you have the ability to control the environment much more so than other types of research, right? You can set up the lab setting, you can cut down on noise, you can make things like temperature comfortable, right? As a result, you can come much closer to determining causality among the variables. And it's easier to get a large sample size compared to something like case studies, although harder than for like a correlational study. Although there are some experiments that can be run through like a survey monkey, where you randomize people to get exposed to certain media or whatnot. And so then that might not be harder than doing a correlational study, right? Disadvantages. So just as Funder says, like a theory's greatest strength is also often its greatest weakness, we could see that with research methods as well. So although it's really tempting to say, yes, we ruled everything out, woohoo, because we did this experiment, we controlled everything, there's still variables you don't anticipate, you can't control, that are going to make a difference. And it's not always clear whether what's occurring in the experiments is what you expect to occur. Give you an example from my own research. I did a meta-analysis when I was in graduate school, looking at the impact of social comparison based on appearance. So comparing yourself to somebody else and how that affects your body dissatisfaction. One of the most common ways to study this has been an experimental manipulation where you show some people images of like skinny people and other people might see like perfume ads, right? Well, one of the things I found in that meta-analysis is you were not finding as strong of relationships from those experimental studies as when you directly measured social comparison. So even though they were assuming people were comparing to those images, maybe not everybody was. Maybe some people just looked at it and were like, okay, that's a model, cool, right? And it didn't affect them in any way, shape, or form for that reason. So, you know, we think we're doing things with experiments, but maybe sometimes we're not. In addition, again, greatest strength, greatest weakness, you're bringing people into the lab, you're controlling everything, this is great. It also makes it really artificial, right? So what they measure may not be the same as what would occur in the real world, right? When you're responding to someone with someone sitting there staring at you, right? Or knowing that your results are being recorded, that might be really different to what you would actually do in the real world. Experiments do sometimes require deception, which a lot of people see as problematic. We'll talk about that in a few slides. And sometimes experiments just cannot be performed. Again, we can use quasi-experiments for this, but we are never going to do something like, let's randomize someone to be abused, right? No. You could also sort of merge the experiment and the case study. And this is what's called a single case design or single case experiment. Or single subject design. So these are case studies that are within a scientific framework. You're going to study the same individual over a period of time, and their behavior at one time is going to be compared to their behavior at a later time. And typically, this is often after we introduce some sort of variable or intervention or therapeutic technique. The most common one is the ABAB, and the letters just represent different phases of the experiment with that individual. So the first A would be baseline. You're not doing anything, you're just measuring that behavior as it naturally occurs. The first B is where you introduce that independent variable. See if it changes the behavior. Maybe it does, woohoo! But it doesn't mean it actually caused it, because you've got one person and they could be having a lot of other stuff going on in their life, right? So then what you do is you take away your intervention, see what happens. Does the behavior go back to baseline? And then if it does, you reintroduce your intervention and stick with it, typically because it's helping the person. So I have an example of this. This is a single case design of a case. Chris is a pseudonym. Chris was a 19-year-old female who had a severe developmental delay. So she was probably operating more on like a childlike standard. Since the age of 3, she had pulled her hair out of her scalp This is an impulse control or anxiety related disorder called trichotillomania. Y'all don't have to know the word, but just a fun word to say. And like many people with this disorder, hers was so severe that she would get bald spots because she would just sit there and pull and pull and pull. And so they did an ABAB to try to see what can we do to help Chris, because unfortunately, the therapies that have been developed and that work for people with trichotillomania require a fairly high level of functioning. There's a lot of like cognitive discussion and talking about constructs. And so those are just not going to work with someone who was at a childlike level, right? So what they did, and I think just given how long this baseline is, I think they tried a whole bunch of other stuff first, but what they ended up doing was they just put 2.5 pound wrist weights on Chris. And she tended to manipulate terrible. She watched TV. So they actually just, with her consent, with her parents' consent, set up a camera. So while she was watching TV, they would record and see how much of that time she was spent pulling out her hair. And so what you see is when they put the weights on her wrists, she went down to not pulling her hair at all, because when she moved her arm, she realized it. A lot of times people do this sort of unconsciously. But as you can see, they had tried a bunch of stuff baseline, and like sometimes it would go away, but then it would come back. So they said, all right, what if we take the weights off? And she went back to manipulation sort of in her average, around 60% of the time. And then they reapplied the weights, no hair picking. So a simple intervention, not something you would do to someone else with the same disorder, right? Who could engage with the typical therapy. But a beautiful example of an ABAB. One of the things, yeah.
So how does single study like case design differ from a longitudinal or others?
Good question. Yeah, the biggest thing is like the amount of data you're gonna have. So with a single case design, you're only gonna have one person. And you'll have lots of time points, but only that one person, so you're limited in how much data you can get. Whereas with a longitudinal data, you're gonna, I mean, typically well-funded longitudinal studies are like hundreds of thousands of people. And you have all those data points. That's such a good question. Yeah. So one of the things that Funder talks about that I think is really important is the idea of representative design, because each of these different types of research method is only giving us a snapshot or a little piece of what's actually going on. Brunswick, recognizing this, suggested that in addition to sampling participants, we should sample different types of methods. So we should use different methods to ask the same question. And also different domains. So not just college students, right, who are in psych classes, but also maybe you randomly draw from the list of the entire enrolled population of that college. Different methods, doing a correlational and an experimental and a longitudinal study asking the same question. Different types of performances. Several different ways of the IV being applied. So for example, if we're trying to get people to feel depressed or sad, we might try music in one study, or sad video clips in another study, reading a sad passage in a third study. There are, of course, major challenges to this. It's very expensive to do so, very time consuming for single researchers to engage in this process. And again, if we think about junior faculty trying to get enough publications for tenure, right, this becomes a little difficult. So the solutions that Funder suggests are to consider many studies performed by both the same research lab, but also different research labs over time. A way of doing this quantitatively is a technique called meta-analysis. And this involves you take a bunch of studies, and now instead of each person within a study being a data point, each study itself becomes a data point. And by combining multiple studies and comparing over studies, we're able to see trends over time and across multiple research methodologies. So, okay, we can do that, but like in a single study, how the heck do we decide or know whether these results mean anything? Well, we do testing with statistics to determine the statistical significance. The overarching term for the commonly used method is null hypothesis significant testing, which is a really complicated way of saying we're asking the question, what are the chances of having found the same result on accident if nothing was really going on? The most common statistic of significance that's given is the P level. So if you've ever read research studies and in the results, they're like P is less than 0.001, right? That's your P level or significance level. And the P level gives the probability of getting that same result if the actual result was nothing, essentially. So what's the probability of getting that result by accident? There are some problems with applying P and null hypothesis significant testing. One is that it's really difficult to actually describe results. So again, like P is technically giving us the probability the result would be found if the null hypothesis was true. Ugh, just saying that is like a little bit of a tongue twister, right? In addition, one of the things that we see in the literature, and this is not just based in psychology, this is in a lot of different disciplines, is you see the P of 0.05 or lower being seen as significant. That somehow this is like a magic cutoff, but why not make that 0.06, 0.10, 0.01? It really is sort of arbitrary. It's based on the idea that you're essentially like 95% sure that it didn't happen by chance. But why is it 95%? Why not 90 or 99, right? Another problem is that P level only looks at what's called type 1 error. Now, type 1 error means that saying two variables have a relationship when they do not. So this might be like spreading a rumor that two people are dating or hooking up or not. It doesn't look at type 2 error. Type 2 error means saying one variable is not in a relationship with another variable when it is. So this is assuming two people are not dating, so you hit on that hot person you're attracted to, and it could turn out he's dating a friend of yours, and it could be a year later after they break you up, she set you up with him, and now you've been married for 15 years. That may or may not be my story if I met my husband. But you don't want to make that mistake, right? I did not actually hit on him, and so once I realized they were dating, and then I didn't break the friend code because she's the one who set us up later. Dude, life, man. Another issue is that even if the results are statistically significant, that doesn't necessarily mean that your finding has applicable meaning for people's lives. It can be sort of arbitrary. What we want to look at is what's called clinical significance, which is, does this actually make a difference in the real world? Does this actually apply to people's lives, helping them feel better, worse, etc.? For example, if we're treating a personality disorder, does the difference we find statistically actually make a difference in symptom reduction? Yeah, if I have a large enough sample, I might find there's a difference between someone scoring a 42 on a scale and someone scoring a 40, and that's significantly different. But does that actually mean something in that person's life? Are they living a better life because I changed it by 2 points? It could be, or it could not be. Now, one of the other things that you'll look at and see reported in studies is effect sizes. So again, if we just look at p-values, we say these two variables are significantly related, but what does that mean? Doesn't mean anything. Effect size allows us to see how big that difference actually is, or how impactful in some ways the magnitude of that relationship. There are many different statistics you can use to measure effect size. One is just the correlation coefficient, or R. This can be calculated from any type of data, including experimental data. But it can be difficult to interpret what differences mean. Another issue, you take the square of R, you take the correlation coefficient and you square it. This gives you the percentage of the variance explained by the results, and Funder hates this. You read the chapter, Funder's like, this is misleading, this is confusing, who cares? There's another variable called Cohen's d that's very often used. In the one meta-analysis I published, we use Cohen's d. It's comparable to R, and you just calculate it by looking at the difference of the means divided by a standard deviation. You can also do something very fancy that Funder loves called a binomial effect size display, where you use a big table, which is great, but like, are you gonna do that for every relationship between every variable in your study? Like, there are page limits when you submit something to a journal. There are table limits and figure limits, right? It's maybe not that practical, but Funder loves it and goes on about it for a while if you want to know more about it. And this basically tells you how much of an effect an experimental intervention is likely to have and how well you can predict an outcome based on it. Talking about ethics here very quickly. One of the things we always want to consider is how research will be used or misused. So for example, if we are doing a study and we find gender or racial or sexual orientation differences, there are people out there who will use those to justify biases. And if we find a measure doesn't work as well, say for a given race, should we even be using that measure in the future? Something to think about. Another big problem can be fabrication or manipulation of data. The most classic example of this is the Andrew Wakefield vaccine study. So if you're not familiar with the study, for years and to this day, people cite a study from 1998 by Wakefield that said that the MMR vaccine causes autism in kids. It's been used repeatedly to champion not vaccinating your children by people like Jenny McCarthy and unfortunately some politicians. A lot of problems with this study. It was not approved by any kind of ethics committee. He subjected children to invasive procedures without their assent or their parents' consent. My favorite factoid is he took blood samples at his child's birthday party. Like, have a goodie bag and let me have some of your blood. What? He literally fabricated data. Give you a little readout from the Sunday Times article about this. In most of the 12 cases, the children's ailments, as described, were different from their hospital and doctor records. Although the research paper claimed people problems came on within days of getting the vaccine. In only one case did medical records suggest this was true. And in many of the cases, medical concerns had been raised before the children were vaccinated. It was basically like, he just lied. And the reason he lied was not because he wanted to scare people away from vaccines. His original reason was that he was involved with the manufacture of a competing vaccine. And so he wanted people to be afraid of that one. So the one he had a financial investment in could be marketing. One of the years I taught this, I was like really in a tizzy and I told my students, vaccinate your goddamn children. You know, maybe I don't need to swear about it, but the science says that there have been studies since funded by anti-vax groups that have shown there's no connection. They get a little upset. And then we also mentioned deception, just talk about that really briefly. Some argue that it's necessary to test some things, but one of the main problems is it can lead to mistrust and to participants overthinking, trying to figure out what we're really trying to do. And just a fun little cartoon to end our day. So, we're going to get to the pieces book for Friday because we'll have our first discussion at 9. And I have 2 copies if anyone needs to borrow one of mine. I didn't think I'd get all the way through that, but I did. Woohoo! Have a good day, Zoom folks.